very warm welcome, everyone, to this Oxford China Centre conversation number 3. And today we have a question incredibly pertinent to China's past, present and future, which is the meaning of family changing in China? And if so, how? And we are incredibly fortunate to have 3 very distinguished, experienced researchers who bring different perspectives to bear on this question. We have with us Professor Harriet Evans. She's Professor Emeritus of Chinese Cultural Studies at the University of Westminster and visiting Professor of Anthropology at the LSE. She's also Chair of the Trustees to the London-based NGO, The Rights Practice. Her very many publications include a number of books that are incredibly relevant to today. Women and Sexuality in China, Discourses of Female Sexuality and Gender since 1949, Picturing Power in the People's Republic of China, Posters of the Cultural Revolution, The Subject of Gender, Daughters and Mothers in Urban China, which is really one of the only studies I'm aware of that looks at intimate relationships between adult children and elder generation. And then her most recent book, published just last year by Duke University Press, Beijing from Below, Stories of Marginal Lives in the Capital's Center. We also have with us Professor Xiaoying, Associate Professor in Sociology at Australian Catholic University. Her first book, Globalized Knowledge Flows and Chinese Social Theory, won the Raywin Connell Prize from the Australian Sociological Association. Her most recent book, published just this year by Oxford University Press, is Remaking Families in Contemporary China. And it is another wonderful book based on lots of rich field work in China, offering very many unique insights. And last but not least, we're lucky to have with us Professor Suen Tung. He is Assistant Professor and Graduate Division Head at the Gender Studies Program, Faculty of Social Science in the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And he's also an adjunct appointment in the Public Health School. He has a vast number of very impressive publications in top-ranked journals in gender, sexuality, sociology, China, and public health. And he has been involved or leading on at least 2 major studies. One is a mixed method study on same-sex sexual identity label usage in contemporary mainland China and Hong Kong in an era of global LGBT politics. And the other is a mixed method study on lesbian and gay identities of business professionals living abroad in an era of the unequal development of gay rights around the globe. He has also been very involved in a lot of activism and public engagement, most recently yesterday in the International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia. Indeed, sexuality and non-heterosexual identities is very understudied, but a hugely important topic in the Chinese and East Asian context. So we very much welcome the insights that he will bring. So without further ado, let's hand over to our first distinguished speaker, Harriet Evans.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for that very generous introduction. And I'm just putting my stopwatch on so that I don't run over. And let me first say that it's a real honor to be here with the 2 other panelists, whose work, of course, I know through reading their work, but we've never actually met. So even though we're meeting virtually, it's a wonderful occasion to talk about something that is incredibly important. And Chigusa, I want to thank you as well, for starters, for organizing all of this so seamlessly and efficiently. And it's a great pleasure to meet you as well. So the question is the meaning of family changing in China? If so, how? And I mean, for starters, I just want to say that this is a vast topic that has long preoccupied scholars of China, that touches on some of the most intimately experienced aspects of everyday life, historically and now. One of the truisms of Chinese society that successive leaders, and now most notably President Xi Jinping, draw on, refers to the centrality of family in Chinese culture and society. And the term used to refer to this now is jiaguo qinghuai, love of the family and country. Of course, in law and social life, the family is pretty important in most places we know of, but it takes a particular form in China due to the historical embeddedness in social, cultural, and political life of Confucian practices of generational and gendered hierarchy, centering on filial piety and the implementation in law at different scales of obligations and responsibilities that reflect this hierarchy. I should have said to begin with, by the way, that I'm just going to give a sort of few reflections on the historicity of this topic. So to cut a long and really, really fascinating story abysmally short, the new People's Republic of China government in the early 1950s followed up on previous policies developed by the Communist Party since its founding in 1921. We are, after all, celebrating the centenary year of the Chinese Communist Party, with its first marriage law of the People's Republic of China. This prohibited all venal transactions in marriage and replaced parental involvement in marriage arrangements with free choice marriage, so-called, the only legally recognized union of the new socialist family. Alongside this, other policies sought to disrupt the economic power of the corporate kin structure that dominated family life and upheld Confucian practices in many, if not most, areas of the country. It sought to do this by untying, the word is songbang, the ropes that bound the individual to traditional family and social structures and replaced them with obligations of loyalty to the collective and state. Critics of the new government at the time, including, of course, the McCarthy lobby in the US, denounced the communists for wanting to destroy the family. However, replacing hierarchically structured kin ties with political loyalties was far from destroying the family. And here I want to make a few points that I hope you'll find interesting. Many important scholars writing in the 1980s argued that neither rural collectivization nor the nationalization of industry significantly dislodged many practices associated with the generational and gender conventions of patriarchal tradition. Eliminating the economic basis that tied the individual to the family group was the first step in a prolonged process of transformation of both the family structure and the position and experiences of individuals within it. The much discussed post-Mao individualization of intimate and family relationships is the most recent stage in this process of socioeconomic and cultural transformation. But the privileging of the individual subject in contemporary consumer and family culture that mainstream accounts now focus on has to be understood as a distinctive stage in a longer process of change, which has been uneven, inconsistent, and patchy. It is not simply a result of the developments engendered by marketization of the economy under China's embrace of global capitalism. Policies of gender equality pursued throughout the Mao era transformed the life experiences of successive generations of women in employment and education, making women's literacy rates under Mao some of the highest in the global South. Yet gender equality did not extend to a critical examination of the family and domestic division of labor. Showcase examples aside, as much research has shown, demonstrates that women shouldered the so-called double burden throughout the Mao era. Indeed, it was considered part of women's biologically ordained and natural responsibilities to marry and have children. The historical legacy of these last two factors established a basis in practice and belief that became central figures of the emerging market economy in the post-Mao years. Finally, it is worthwhile bearing in mind that family structures and practices have and continue to be widely divergent in China. So talking about the family, in a sense, is a non-starter. And while in terms of household ownership and everyday residence, the nuclear family dominates in large and medium-sized towns and cities, this is often accompanied by childcare arrangements facilitated by the nearby residence of one, if not both sets of grandparents whose everyday activities like cooking, picking up children from school, and so on, resemble those of the full-time family members, if I can put it like that. New research on this demonstrates the continuation of practices of childcare premised on ideas about the family unit that hark back to previous practices while adapting to changing market circumstances. So just to wrap up, what has changed? One aspect of this diversity has been to create what appear to be many paradoxes, notably of women's feisty assertion of autonomy and independence when it comes to employment and income generation, alongside practices and beliefs that elsewhere I have discussed as a kind of patchy patriarchy, practices that continue to privilege the authority of the man, but in forms that are distinct from the traditions of Confucian patriarchy. And a new generation of post-millennial women are making choices about family and marriage and family life that do indeed signify a distinct shift from earlier practices. Some are choosing simply to reject marriage and children on the grounds that such practices deny them the possibilities of freedom and autonomy, and others, particularly wealthy and well-educated urbanites, are using their wealth, beauty, and accomplishments to play the marriage market to their own advantage. These tendencies have recently been critically approached through the lens of a revised version of social reproduction theory under the category of made in China feminism, proposed by the scholars Dong Yige and Angela Wu. So yes, of course, the meaning of family is changing, and it has been in China in uneven directions for some time over the last century, certainly, if not longer, though not necessarily in ways that correspond with mainstream narratives of change. And just to really finish, so it's certainly not been a story that corresponds with the familiar modernization argument that economic development and education generate small nuclear units, privileging the needs and interests of the individual person. The issue is much more complex, as we'll now hear from the other two speakers. So thank you very much for that opportunity to just do terrible injustice to a vast project.
Thank you so much, Harriet. Now we hand over to Professor Xiaoying. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for your very generous introduction, and thank you to CUHK for convening this conversation. It is my honor to be involved in this event. We are asked, is the meaning of family in China changing? And if so, how? This is a big topic, so big you could write a book about it, which is what I recently did. The book is called Remaking Families in Contemporary China, just published by Oxford University Press. Rather than recount what's in the book, I'll indicate here two things that have changed China and family life over the past 4 decades. Firstly, rural to urban labor migration, and second, the growth of private wills. Thinking of changes to family life in the context of China's massive internal labor migration, the elderly and children left behind in the villages and small towns are frequently mentioned. In contrast to much of the discussion of left behind children, Rachel Murphy's recent book, The Children of China's Great Migration, highlights the agency of such children rather than their hopelessness. I want to mention another, largely neglected aspect of the impact of labor migration on family life, namely grandparents. Increasingly, migrant parents take their children to the cities where they seek employment. When both spouses in a migrant couple work full-time, childcare and home care arise as material issues. The obvious solution is a grandparent or grandparents who join the household. There is, in fact, a significant and continuously growing number of aged people, largely overlooked in discussion and research, who join the so-called floating population of China's internal migration. Through fieldwork, I identified a population of elderly men and women, which I call floating grandparents, who are a key element in the changing pattern of China's families and in the transformation of norms that underlie family life. Traditional obligation of filial piety, which historically regulated family life, included a requirement that adult children practice 父母在，不远游. When parents are alive, children shouldn't travel too far afield. With labor migration today, a population of elderly parents themselves travel far and actively redefine their roles in order to satisfy their children's and their grandchildren's needs. Much is written about how young people transform ideals of family obligation. In understanding the families of rural to urban labor migrants in China today, it is grandparents who initiate reinterpretations of and renegotiate established meanings and practices that underlie family responsibility. The second massive change that has occurred in China over the past 40 years that has impacted on families is increased income and private wealth. The scale and significance of this development cannot be underestimated. Since the transformation of the Chinese economy from the 1980s, family relationships have been affected by the assets that family members now possess or have access to. As private property shapes the consciousness of entitlement and the capacities through which power is exercised in families, patriarchal elements inform relations between family members in new ways. Traditionally, family wealth was accessed only by males. Today, females have equal rights to shared property as spouses and daughters, and they may generate property through their own efforts to be deployed on their own terms. China's one-child policy operated from 1979 to 2015. It resulted in a number of daughter-owning urban families, a problem for parents concerned with the continuity of the patrilineal surname and property inheritance. While married women in China would typically retain her birth surname, her children would have her husband's surname. Today, a wife from daughter-only family is likely to provide her surname rather than her husband's to their children. What could be less patriarchal than this? In fact, however, such surnaming practices preserve the family line of a married daughter's father. Such practices obscure patriarchal control under the guise of promoting women's rights. I call this veiled patriarchy. Surnaming practices relate to many issues, including gender and kinship. Underlying these concerns is property and the power of property. And also, of course, issues of inheritance. These new surnaming practices indicate not only the inventiveness, but also the coherence of this then explicit but nevertheless forceful patriarchal element of family relationships in contemporary China. Property has become increasingly important more generally to marriage, divorce, and later life remarriage. Property is concrete and exchangeable. Intimacy, on the other hand, is always particular and inherent in a relationship. Like property, though, intimacy has become important in family life in China over the past 40 years. Spousal intimacy in China is affected by a continuing value of intergenerational reciprocity and the lifelong commitments to family ties that extend beyond those between husband and a wife. These important topics might be explored in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, you've offered us really interesting, unique lenses through which to look at continuity and change in the Chinese family, especially surname practices, floating grandparents, and new developments, very contradictory developments around property, and especially the implications for women there. Now, our third distinguished speaker, Professor Tung, is going to take us into new terrain, but it's all connected. I mean, from some of the reading that I've done, I believe that some of the issues around homosexual relationships in China is anxiety around family continuity. Rather than anything else, but given the acceptance we now have in China around only daughters, you know, maybe that also opens up new routes of acceptance within Chinese family culture. But we're going to hand over now to you as the expert on this topic.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for your kind introduction as well as the invitation. And also thank you to Chigusa for coordinating. And actually, it's also especially warm for me because I actually spent 5 years at Oxford, both for my master and DPhil. I actually also sat in Rachel's class, I think about more than 10 years ago now. And so it's my incredible honor to join today's discussion, and I want to focus on the aspect of sexuality and gender in my intervention. So I think in a lot of China studies as well as family studies that heteronormativity and cisgenderism are basically sort of the undertones of it. They refer to the ideas that in a lot of our discussion, both in general society as well as in academia, that we somehow take heterosexuality and people being cisgender as the norm or as the basis of our discussion. However, that would leave people who identify as LGBT+ being understudied. And I think that also takes place in China family studies. So LGBT+ refer to two interrelated but distinctive ideas of sexual orientation and gender identity. So in particular, people whose sexual orientation are lesbian, gay, or bisexual are referred to as the sexual minorities, and people whose gender identity is transgender are referred to as gender minorities. In fact, there has been a lot of anthropological and sociological discussion as to the extent to which that these terms that I've mentioned so far that have been largely emerging from the Western context, whether they apply to the Chinese context or not, and whether terms like Tung refers to more localized understanding of their identities. But these I don't have time to unpack today. I want to talk about the relationship between being LGBT plus and family in terms of two aspects. The first one is the relationship between LGBT plus people with their family of origin, and the other one is about LGBT plus people forming their own families. So despite that, there has been no formal criminalization of sexuality in the Chinese concept, in the Chinese context, unlike many other jurisdictions around the world. In the Chinese context, except in the form of hooliganism, that there has been no formal criminalization of homosexuality in the past. But because, exactly as Rachel mentioned earlier, because of the emphasis on carrying the family name as well as traditional gender role expectations, the relationship between LGBT plus people and their family of origin has been very intense, and it's been very much documented by extant literature. And that has been referred to as the operation of the family biopolitics, that the regulation of sexuality sometimes may not be as much about religion and law as we see in other parts of the world, but more coming from family, which results in unacceptance, negative attitudes, and also negative treatment. Scholars have also argued that that can also be attributable to exacerbation by the one-child policy that has been in place until recently. And also, it has also affected the operationalization of being LGBT plus in the Chinese context, that it has been argued that identity politics plays out very differently in the Chinese context compared to other parts of the world, where coming out plays a very big part in an LGBT plus person's life, whereas there is some discussion of a form of politics called coming home, in which that some LGBT plus people may not necessarily come out of the corset and name their sexual identity, but bring their same-sex partner back home and then have their loved one accepted, but without giving the label of LGB in a way. And you may also have heard that, say, during the Lunar New Year or in family gatherings, that can also be a particularly challenging time for LGBT plus people. And also, this also affects how LGBT plus people form their own family, which results in phenomenon that you might also be familiar with, discussion about Tung, which refers to wives of homosexual men. Because of the societal and familial pressure, then there is a huge number of homosexual men who feel the pressure to engage in a different sex relationship in order to satisfy the family demand and also the social demand. And it also results to in another phenomenon of nominal marriage, in which that some gay men and lesbians arrange themselves to be married so that they can each satisfy the demand of their respective families in a way, so that they can be both seen as having satisfied the familial expectation of getting married as well. And there are 4 points that I want to talk about: the changes and the non-changes and the uneven development. I think there are some aspects that we can see some changes. It is undeniable that being sexual and gender minority now has got more visibility in the Chinese context as compared to before. PFLAG, which is the Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gay Men in China, it has grown to be one of the largest organizations that support non-heterosexual people, and also the LGBT plus social movement and the civil organizations have been operating in challenging environments but still thriving. And also the more possibility for LGBT plus people forming their own family has also been enabled by technology. But as I mentioned earlier, there are aspects that we still see changes not happening yet. So the very fact that Tung and nominal marriage are taking place still show that the extent to which the familial demand and the pressure is still on. And also there's been a lot of discussion in sexuality studies and family studies that in terms of the push to recognizing same-sex relationship and same-sex marriage, whether there could also be the homonormativity politics taking place, meaning that fighting for inclusion could mean a consolidating of the traditional marriage system rather than challenging it. And actually there has also been some rather surprising regulation on trans issues that say for a trans person to undergo sex change operation, they would require family approval in the Chinese context. And there are only 2 points that I want to further make is that I think the change in terms of the gender and sexual minorities that I've been talking about is also obviously uneven as well. We see very clear rural-urban differences in terms of attitudes towards LGBT+ issues. And I would also argue that the change on gender and sexual minorities issues have also been oscillating as well. The space and for civil society and also the ways in which being LGBT+ can manifest itself in mainland China has also, the space has both expanded and shrunk within a very short period of time, and the direction in which it travels is also sometimes uncertain. So given the very limited time, I think that's how I'm going to just very quickly share my thoughts there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting. I already have loads of questions for all of you, but I'm not going to do that because we have questions. We have a question from our audience. So a question from Harriet. Do you think Xi's highlight on jia or family as units that constitute guo or the nation is a way of preventing organizing based on other identities or class interests? I don't know how to phrase it correctly, but I always have the feeling that jia's importance grows along with the commercialization of public space. Harriet, that question's for you. Do you have thoughts? It's a big question, a very interesting one. Do you have some initial reflections?
Do you want me to answer it now?
Yes, please go ahead. It's open discussion now. So
okay.
Please, audience, send in your questions. Harriet, feel free to talk, and panelists also feel free to ask questions and comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, this is a very complex issue, of course, and the kind of political, ideological interests of the Chinese government under Xi Jinping are inseparably tied to the way in which jia, family, household, kin group is associated with, inscribed in notions of war, country, and state. And you say that you feel that the growing importance of jia grows along with the commercialization of public space. I would have said, yes, I think that that is true, but the other dimension to this is the inclusion of a kind of hark back to Confucian traditions, Neo-Confucian traditions, if you want, as part of that process of commercialization. So in conditions in which, as Xiaoying points out as well, in conditions in which wealth and access to grandparents is crucial to the welfare of children, and is dependent on access to private services, the emphasis on reinventing, if you want, re-emphasizing Confucian ideology of respect for the older generation as the foundation of social stability and social harmony. I think that the you know, you can think of it as the 2 C's, if you want, you know, the Confucian revival within conditions of commercialization of family and welfare services. I think that's, for now, not to take up too much time, that's how I would answer your question. But certainly it's a very, very important question. I don't know whether that's adequate. I mean, I just don't want to hog the show here.
Thank you very much. Please do feel free to jump in. We do have another question here. Dear panelists, thanks a lot for the amazing presentations. One possible question that I'd love to kindly inquire of our respectable professors, whether if there is any historical factors that possibly result in parents' incredibly high expectation and anxiety towards their children, the concept of wangzi chenglong over the past several decades. I mean, that's already a very large question. I mean, if I can also piggyback on that to observe what seems to be sort of the waning authority of the olders vis-a-vis the youngers, and yet the increased involvement of parents in children's lives, even down to Tung's fascinating example that you need family approval for to transition your gender. So I'm just wondering, you know, what kind of comments or thoughts our panelists have in relation. Here we have the question, the historical factors that feed into parents' high expectations and anxiety, and linked to that, the sort of the contradiction between in waning elder power, but immense involvement in all aspects of life, including divorce from Xiaoying's work or whatever. Do we have, Harriet, would you like to share?
Yeah, I can share, but I think that Xiaoying and Tung need to share this as well. I mean, I think you're right, Rachel, to point out that on the one hand, we have what seems to be the declining authority of the older generation, which in the terms of the wonderful anthropologist Yan Xiang in the University of California, Los Angeles, is part of this process, as I tried to indicate, that really has been going on since the early days of the People's Republic. If we see it within that framework, then I see, you know, life is full of paradoxes and contradictions and inconsistencies. So Rachel is right to say, yes, there's the waning authority of the older generation, at the same time as there are all sorts of practices that are promoted, if you like, by the market and by the accumulation of wealth that reconsolidate the dependency on the older generation for things like childcare. And there, I think one has to kind of look at the payoff, the informal payoff between expectations on the older generation to look after the children while the parents are away or not. I mean, what Xiaoying describes happens in the urban sector as well, alongside unspoken maybe expectations that the younger generation will look after the older generation when they need it. So I think that these contradictions and these paradoxes are just part of the whole picture.
Thank you so much. Tung, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that is a really relevant question, because for me, I think what I was talking about, although it seemed LGBT plus specific, but actually I think that also paints the larger picture in terms of the anxiety between parental control and the expression of individuality on the part of the children. And exactly, I think, as you mentioned, I think there's that, like on one hand of the waning parental control, but also sort of trying to regain that by, say, some of our studies show that like sometimes even like the negative treatment actually comes from the family of origin rather than like other members of the public or other domains of life in LGBT plus people. So sometimes when we see, say, conversion therapy, which is an effort that to try to change a person's sexual orientation, in a lot of LGBT plus people's life in China, actually it comes from the family rather than other spheres of life. So I think for me, although it specifically talks about gender and sexuality, but it paints a broader picture of the tension of the waning control and then trying to regain control, and sometimes even manifests itself in these kinds of rather extreme measures of control rather than acceptance and love when a child expresses themselves differently. And so for me, it tells more than only gender and sexuality in a sense. Yeah.
It's really interesting. Thank you so much. Xiaoying, did you have thoughts on this?
I agree with the panelists that we could see paradoxical elements in terms of this issue. On the one hand, parents' private absolute authority gained as public authority has in a way given way to monetized economy in a sense. We could see that children have more say in many issues, not only in terms of family issues, but also in their future prospects. But on the other hand, as you all mentioned, paradoxically, marketization in China has also, in a way, through which that parents have gained authority in other issues. For instance, with privatization of housing, it is increasingly unlikely or very difficult for a young couple to purchase an apartment of their own. And one way to resolve this issue is either they move in to live with their parents or parents-in-law, or another solution is that the husband or bridegroom's parents provide a wedding apartment, or parents provide installment or deposit of a mortgage for the young couple. And then in this sense, and the parents have a lot of say in the decisions of where that young couple's location should be. So it's more likely, and in many cases, that the young couple's residence will be close to that of the elderly parents. So because in terms of on both sides, they benefit both sides. For the young couple, when they have a child, and the parents normally would provide childcare and household chores. And on the other hand, for the elderly parents, and it is more convenient for them to be able to access assistance help when such a need arises.
Rachel, could I just say something else?
Please go ahead.
Just very briefly, I mean, I think that just in response to the idea, the suggestion, which is, you know, empirically and experientially very, very much part of family life in urban and rural China, in my experience, you know, the high expectations linked to anxiety about children, I think, are also engendered outside the framework of the family, and by the incredible pressure of the need to succeed and achieve within, engendered by the education system. And this is, and I mean, I won't go on at great length, but I think that this factor, in conditions in which parents until recently have had only one child, that this is of extraordinary, I mean, it's outside the framework of my speciality, but it is of extraordinary importance in, and you know, anybody who's a parent in the UK with children will know that education and concerns about one's child and how well one's child does in school and so on and so forth are kind of very, very much part of family life. So I think, you know, this is a point where the competitive education system and, you know, the internal relationships and structures within the family kind of really intersect in ways that add to parental anxiety.
That's really interesting. I mean, to invoke Yan Yunxiang again and his concept of descending familialism, the idea that, you know, the family goes from worshipping ancestors to then during the Mao era, you know, loyalty to the nation state, and now it's all about loyalty to cultivating the perfect only grandchild, which then deflects attention away from civic spaces is one of his arguments. And the reason I highlight that is it segues into this next question we have on our chat, which is, could we say, as looking to this family process of westernization, could we say that these changes, I'm not quite, could we say, as looking to this family process of westernization, that China is fit for more democracy? I'm not sure I fully understand that question. I think maybe maybe the question is highlighting some of the changes that our speakers have alluded to and saying perhaps aspects of that resemble what we see in the West, in that there's more attention to the individual within the family unit and so on. Does that make China fit for more democracy? I'm not sure. Anyway, please interpret that question how you see best, panelists, and see what thoughts come to mind. My mind, it was Yan Yunxiang and saying sort of the cult of the family in China is in a way deflects or is a response to the fact that there's not very many other spheres for interpersonal connections in the current political context. But let's hear from our panelists. Do one of you have immediate thoughts to think in relation to this question, that changes in the family linked to perhaps democratization or not in China? Do we have any thoughts on that question?
I have a general thought, but I always have thoughts, and maybe the other two people want to say something.
Please go ahead. It might.
I mean, my general thought is that this question, phrased in the way that it is, it somehow corresponds with the idea that the changing family relationships and gender and generational relationships are promoting greater equality within the family, and that somehow that is kind of spilling out into broader society. I mean, my own take on that is that this is that it's a mistaken argument, that changes in the family are in some senses promoting greater equality, in other senses they're not. And the barriers to, and it all depends on what we mean by equality within the family, certainly. And I mean, when we're talking about gender relationships, and that Xiaoying has talked about and Tung has talked about, and that, you know, I've written a lot about, I think that we're far from seeing any kind of linear, straightforward progress towards equality within the family. And so while from certain perspectives you could argue that, you know, women have more leverage, as they certainly do, and as Xiaoying argues, and have more authority in decisions concerning the household budget and so on and so forth, which they do, that in itself reflects more equal relationships, which I have, I'm afraid I simply do not agree with. And so while, you know, and in a society as huge and diverse as China, it's really, really difficult to talk about how changes within family structures might be impacting on broader civil society. But I think that, so just to finish this thought that I have, I think that one needs to be very, very cautious about imagining that what seem to be equalizing processes spill out into more equalizing processes in society at large. I mean, Tung's example of family approval needed for individuals to transition is an example of that. So it's just a word of caution, I think, in response to the assumptions behind that question. That's my thought.
And also my thought is that I think it's also pretty interesting when we look at, say, being LGBT plus in the Chinese context, that actually a lot of LGBT plus people would say that the most difficult domain of life that they face, as I mentioned earlier, actually sometimes comes from family, that even could be even more challenging than friends or even the workplace. And that actually, for me, it's also very interesting. Say, like, sometimes even when you do like research with activists or people who are really involved, that they could be out in many other domains of life, but family is the last and most difficult hurdle in a way. So I echo what Harriet mentioned, that it's also pretty interesting that although there is a lot of development in the family sphere, but sometimes also the persistent inequality and still the very large influence. Because one thing that I also find very interesting is when we look at, say, the influence of family relationship on LGBT plus people's lives in other parts of the world, usually that declines after adolescence, say when LGBT plus people moved from rural area to urban area in either in search of job or entering university, the influence of family usually declines. But in our research, we find that actually in the Chinese context that persists, almost for an LGBT plus person, there's no idea of like the influence of family leaving from a person's life. So I feel that although there's a lot of development, still the persistence of the influence in the sphere of family sometimes could actually make it more difficult for the LGBT plus people to be themselves in other domains of life as well.
The next question is actually for Xiaoying Qi. This is the question for Dr. Qi regarding the concept floating grandparents. I am wondering if there is a rural-urban divide in this phenomenon. Are urban grandparents more likely to become floating, or is it a heavily rural pattern?
This is a good question, because conventionally people would think that only urban grandparents would relocate to join the adult children to provide child care. And because China has relaxed its population control policy, so now we have a large number of migrants move from rural areas to urban areas to seek employment. And in the past, grandparents remained with grandchildren in rural areas, but increasingly grandparents relocate to join the adult children in the cities to provide childcare and also home care. So why do I call them floating grandparents? Because there is a difference between floating grandparents and the migrant grandparents. Because these grandparents, they when they have a number of strategies. For instance, one grandparent stay in the village and another grandparent would relocate. So if there is something which is happening in the rural area, so the grandparent will move back for a short period of time and then move back to the city. So that's why I call them floating grandparents. And also there are other strategies. For instance, grandparents might just stay with the adult children's family for probably most of year, in a year, and then take the child with her or him back to the village and to stay for a few months, and then back to the city. So, and also a lot of the grandparents indicate that after their grandchildren are able to go to primary schools, and they might return to the hometowns. So that's why I call them floating grandparents. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another question. Thanks a lot for all the fascinating talks. The person says, I have a very broad question. With the re-emphasis and the centrality of gendered family values and women's increasing economic autonomy at the same time, how can urban women navigate their relative freedom from patriarchal constraints of family, society, and the state? And I think we can include lesbian women in this as well. Who would like to start off on another enormous and very rich question?
I'm very happy to.
Go ahead, please.
I mean, you know, there was a lot to cover in a very short space of time, but at the end of my presentation, I did refer to the work of Tung and Angela Wu, both of whom are in the United States, who are working on developing a notion called Made in China feminism, which I think is very, very interesting. And they identify, it's largely kind of urban-based women, young women, these are millennials, not an older generation, some of whom are rejecting the idea of straight marriage and child reproduction and childcare on the grounds that it constrains their freedom and autonomy, and others of whom are just making use of their wealth and their beauty and their achievements to milk the marriage market and to make sure that they marry well so that they can have as luxurious and free a life as possible within the constraints of straight marriage. At the same time, I think it's important to point out that there are increasing numbers, or there were increasing numbers of young straight and lesbian and trans women who were launching all sorts of public protests. The most famous of these, of course, were the Feminist Five, who were arrested in 2015 for staging public protests in Beijing. And it has to be said that news continues to come through social media and even mainstream, the mainstream media, that young feminist activities in China now that are that correspond or that overlap with LGBT plus activities, that these are considered incredibly threatening by the current government in China, and because they threaten the foundations of the heteronormative family. So, you know, I mean, so urban women are trying to navigate their relative freedom in conditions of extreme constraint. And I have total respect for those who continue to give voice to their attempts to do so. Thank you for the question.
Tung?
Yeah, and my thoughts on the economic autonomy, on especially how lesbian and trans women navigate the family life, I immediately think about two aspects. The first one is that for a lot of LGBT plus people, as well as including lesbian and trans women, having the economic autonomy allows one to bargain with the with the familial expectation and control that I mentioned earlier. So sort of being able to set up your own household, having your own home, then allows that leeway away from the earlier family biopolitics that I mentioned. And then I think another one is also the diaspora perspective that similar to what a lot of sexuality studies has pointed out, that I think there's also a significant number of lesbian, trans, and queer women in mainland China would use moving abroad, and either in the more shorter form of studying abroad or the longer form of migration that would also be another form of navigating the freedom as well. However, I think as Harriet mentions that all these different forms that sometimes the state could be seen that as challenging, especially as you could imagine when the idea of diaspora is involved, then the idea of transnational efficacy, and also the idea of breaking away from the traditional ideas of familial expectations. Those are sometimes ideas that the state may not find them very comfortable to live with. Yeah.
Would you like to make a very quick comment, Xiaoying, because we're nearly at, we are at time.
I think this is paradoxical. With the now abolished one-child policy, but we still have a lot of daughter-owning families, because, and then without in a brother's absent family, parents putting a lot of resources to the education of these daughters, so they have a lot of resources, and they have much better education than previous women, so they have a lot of leverage. And on the other hand, because in terms of daughter-only families, and they are the only hope of the family, and also they are the resources of their elder parents in terms of elderly care in the future. So this gives them a lot of leverage.
That's really interesting, but it's also still an environment where they still continue to be expected to marry and to, you know, respond to these revived Confucian ideas of state and order and national ethics and so forth. I mean, it's an incredibly rich field, is research into Chinese family, gender and sexuality, and you've certainly given us a taste of that. So thank you so much to each of you for your time and this conversation, to Chigusa Yamura for all of the work behind the scenes in arranging the logistics, and to all our very many participants who have joined us this afternoon. So thank you again, and I'm keeping an eye out for your future publications.
Thank you so much.